300 people don't just disappear. Not from a locked plantation, not on Christmas morning, not without a sound. But on December 25th, 1859, that's exactly what happened at Belmont Estate in South Carolina. When the overseer arrived at dawn to unlock the quarters, he found the doors still barred from the outside, just as he'd left them the night before. The chains that had bound the enslaved workers lay coiled on the ground like shed skin. The work tools stood arranged in perfect rows. The cooking fires still smoldered, but every single person was gone. No footprints led away through the frost. No boats were missing from the river dock. The bloodhounds brought in from neighboring plantations circled the empty quarters and sat down, confused, as if the scent simply ended. The plantation owner, Thomas Vance, offered a reward equivalent to $500,000 in today's currency. Newspapers across the South published descriptions. Slave catchers combed 3 states for months. They never found a single person, not one body, not one witness, not one clue that made sense. What they did find in the weeks that followed would raise questions that authorities tried desperately to bury. Questions about what had really been happening at Belmont Estate in the months before that Christmas morning. If you're intrigued by mysteries that history tried to forget, subscribe to this channel. We dig into the stories that were meant to stay buried. And this one goes deeper than anyone expected. Before we continue with the story of Belmont Estate and the 300 souls who vanished without a trace, let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where our community of mystery seekers is watching from. Now, to understand what happened that Christmas, you need to understand what Belmont Estate was, and what it had become in the year before everything changed. Because the disappearance didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of months of careful planning, desperate hope, and something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Belmont Estate sat on 1,100 acres along the Combahee River, about 40 miles southwest of Charleston. It wasn't the largest plantation in the Low Country, but it was among the most profitable. Rice. That was the crop that built fortunes in South Carolina, and Thomas Vance had inherited one of the best rice-growing operations in the state when his father died in 1855. The estate had been in the Vance family for 3 generations. Thomas's grandfather, William Vance, had purchased the land in 1798 from a British loyalist family fleeing after the Revolution. He'd built the first rice fields using knowledge borrowed from enslaved Africans who understood the complex irrigation systems required for the crop. By the time Thomas inherited the property, Belmont was producing nearly $40,000 in rice annually, an enormous sum that placed the Vance family among the wealthiest in the region. The main house was a white-columned structure visible from the river, designed to impress visitors arriving by boat. It had 12 rooms, including a library that Thomas's father had filled with books on agriculture, philosophy, and classical literature. The furniture was imported from Europe. The silverware bore the family crest. Everything about the house was designed to project permanence, prosperity, and respectability. Behind the main house stretched the rice fields, vast geometric plots separated by irrigation canals and dikes that controlled the flow of water from the river. The fields looked orderly from a distance, almost beautiful in their precision, but up close, they were brutal. Rice cultivation required workers to stand in water for hours, sometimes up to their waists, exposed to disease, snakes, and the suffocating heat of South Carolina summers. Malaria was common. Accidents were frequent. The work destroyed bodies. The quarters where the enslaved population lived formed a separate compound about a quarter-mile from the main house, positioned so that the main house residents couldn't hear the sounds of daily life there. The crying children, the evening songs, the arguments, the grief. 32 cabins arranged in 4 neat rows. Each cabin housed between 8 and 12 people. The structures were simple. Wooden frames with gaps between the boards, dirt floors, a single fireplace for cooking and heat. In summer they were ovens. In winter they were barely adequate shelter. There was a communal cooking area where meals were prepared in large iron pots. A small infirmary, really just another cabin with a few shelves of basic medical supplies, and surrounding it all, a fence. Not a high fence, not a particularly strong one, but a boundary nonetheless. A line that defined where people were permitted to exist. By 1859, Belmont Estate held 307 enslaved people. The oldest was a woman named Dinah, who was believed to be in her 80s, though no one knew for certain. Birth records weren't kept for enslaved people in the early years. The youngest were infants, born into bondage, their futures already determined. Among the population were skilled workers, carpenters, blacksmiths, seamstresses, cooks, midwives. There were field workers who knew the rhythms of rice cultivation better than any overseer. There were house servants who moved through the main house like ghosts, present but invisible, seeing everything and saying nothing. And there were the children, dozens of them, ranging from infants to teenagers. They worked too, once they were old enough. The youngest carried water to the fields, the older ones learned trades or joined the field gangs. Childhood as such barely existed. Thomas Vance was 31 years old when the disappearance occurred. He had inherited the plantation at 27, after his father suffered a stroke and died within days. Thomas had been educated at the College of Charleston, where he'd studied literature and philosophy before returning home to learn the practical business of plantation management. By all contemporary accounts, he was unremarkable. Not particularly cruel by the standards of the time, but not kind either. He was a businessman who saw the plantation as a machine, and its workers as components of that machine. He kept detailed records of productivity. He calculated the cost of feeding and clothing enslaved workers against their output. He made decisions based on profit margins. He rarely visited the quarters. He left the day-to-day management to his overseer, William Trent, a man who had worked at Belmont for 15 years. Trent was efficient, methodical, and utterly indifferent to the humanity of the people he supervised. He enforced the rules, maintained discipline, and ensured that work quotas were met. Nothing more, nothing less. For years, life at Belmont followed predictable patterns. The seasons dictated the work. Planting in spring, tending the fields in summer, harvest in fall, maintenance in winter. Sundays offered a brief respite. A few hours when people could tend their own small garden plots, mend clothes, or simply rest. Christmas brought a day or two of reduced work, a tradition that most plantation owners observed, partly out of custom and partly because it was believed that small concessions prevented larger rebellions. But in March of 1859, something changed. Thomas Vance traveled to Charleston for a meeting of the Agricultural Society, an organization where plantation owners shared information about crops, markets, and labor management. He returned 3 days later with a guest, Dr. Silas Creighton. Dr. Creighton was not a medical doctor, though he used the title. He held a degree in natural philosophy from what he claimed was a university in Pennsylvania, though later investigations would reveal inconsistencies in his credentials. He was 43 years old, tall and thin, with dark hair graying at the temples and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He had spent years traveling through the Caribbean and South America, studying what he called labor efficiency systems. He'd observed sugar plantations in Cuba, coffee plantations in Brazil, and mining operations in Peru. He'd taken notes on how different populations responded to different management techniques. He'd developed theories about human behavior, motivation, and control. And he'd come to Belmont Estate with a proposal that Thomas Vance found irresistible. He could increase the plantation's productivity by 40% within a year, Creighton claimed, without purchasing additional workers or land. His method was scientific, based on careful observation and the application of principles he'd developed through years of research. All he needed was access to the enslaved population and freedom to implement his system. Vance, who was always looking for ways to increase profits, agreed immediately. He offered Creighton room and board at the main house and a generous fee to be paid at the end of the year if the promised results materialized. Creighton arrived at Belmont with 3 large trunks of equipment. He spent the first week observing, walking through the fields, watching people work, taking notes in a leather-bound journal he carried everywhere. He spoke to no one except Vance and Trent. He simply watched. Then he requested a workspace. Vance gave him use of one of the estate's outbuildings, a structure that had previously been used for storing equipment and supplies. It was about 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a wooden floor, solid walls, and a few small windows. Creighton had the windows covered with heavy cloth. He installed locks on the doors, serious locks, the kind used on warehouses in Charleston. He brought in furniture, a desk, chairs, shelves. He unpacked his equipment, brass instruments with dials and gauges, glass containers of various sizes, leather straps mounted on wooden frames, notebooks and writing implements, lamps that burned with unusual brightness. Workers who glimpsed inside when the doors opened briefly described seeing things they didn't understand. Diagrams on the walls, charts with numbers and symbols, strange tools that looked like they belonged in a doctor's office or a workshop. Within 2 weeks of his arrival, Creighton began what he called assessments. The first group was brought to his building on a Monday morning in late March. 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, all field workers in their 20s and 30s. Trent escorted them from the quarters to Creighton's building and left them there. They emerged 6 hours later. They were quiet. Not silent exactly, but subdued in a way that seemed unusual. When asked what had happened inside, they gave vague answers. "He measured us," one man said. "Asked questions," a woman added. "Nothing more." Over the following weeks, every person at Belmont Estate underwent an assessment. Creighton worked methodically, bringing in groups of 5 or 6 at a time. The sessions lasted anywhere from 4 to 8 hours. What happened during these assessments would later become a subject of intense speculation and horror. Based on testimony from survivors and fragments of Creighton's notes that were eventually discovered, we can piece together some of what occurred. Creighton measured everything: height, weight, arm span, hand size, chest circumference. He measured how far people could reach, how much weight they could lift, how long they could stand without sitting. He timed how quickly they could complete simple tasks, picking up objects, moving from one side of the room to the other, responding to commands. He asked questions, hundreds of questions, about their families, their childhoods, their fears, their dreams, about what made them angry, what made them sad, what made them obedient. He asked about their relationships with other workers, with overseers, with the Vance family. He took notes on everything. Each person had a file, pages of observations written in Creighton's precise handwriting. And then there were the tests. These were more disturbing. Creighton would present people with scenarios, hypothetical situations, and ask how they would respond. He would show them objects and ask them to identify uses. He would give them tasks that seemed pointless, arranging blocks and patterns, repeating sequences of numbers, standing in uncomfortable positions for extended periods, and observe how they reacted. Some people found the assessments merely tedious, others found them deeply unsettling. There was something about Creighton's manner, the way he watched, the way he wrote in his notebook, the way he seemed to be looking not at them but through them, that created a profound sense of unease. But the assessments were only the beginning. Once Creighton had completed his initial observations, he began implementing what he called his system. The work schedule was restructured. People were reassigned to different tasks based on criteria only Creighton understood. Some field workers were moved to maintenance duties. Some house servants were sent to the fields. The changes seemed arbitrary, but Creighton insisted they were based on careful analysis of each person's capabilities and psychological profile. Rations were adjusted. Some people received more food, particularly those Creighton had identified as high-value workers. Others received less. The reductions were small at first, barely noticeable, but they created a hierarchy that hadn't existed before. Work quotas were modified. Some tasks now had specific time limits. Failure to meet these limits resulted in what Crichton called corrective interventions. And then there were the treatments. These began in May, about 2 months after Crichton's arrival. Workers who showed signs of what Crichton called reduced efficiency, illness, exhaustion, or simply moving too slowly, were taken to his building for correction. These sessions were different from the assessments. They lasted longer, sometimes an entire day. And the people who underwent treatment came back, changed. The changes were subtle at first. A field worker named Marcus, who had always been talkative and quick to laugh, returned from a treatment session quiet and focused. He worked faster than before, never pausing to rest, never speaking unless spoken to. His wife said he barely slept anymore. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, as if he'd forgotten how to rest. A woman named Lily, who had been recovering from a fever, underwent treatment and returned moving mechanically, as if her body was operating on instructions her mind wasn't fully processing. She would start a task and continue it until someone physically stopped her, even if the task was complete. A young man named Benjamin developed a tremor in his hands after his treatment. The tremor was constant, making fine work difficult. But he never complained. He never asked for help. He simply worked through it, his hands shaking, his face expressionless. By summer, fear had begun to spread through the quarters. People whispered about Crichton's building. They called it the Correction House or simply his place, speaking of it in hushed tones. Parents warned children to work hard, to never give Trent or Crichton a reason to notice them. But working hard wasn't always enough. Crichton's criteria for who needed treatment seemed to expand. At first, it was only people who were clearly struggling, the sick, the injured, the exhausted. But gradually, others were selected. People who asked too many questions, people who seemed to be forming close friendships with others, people who sang certain songs or told certain stories. It was as if Crichton was trying to identify and eliminate something, some quality or characteristic that he saw as problematic. And then people started dying. The first death occurred in early July. Henry was 32 years old, a field worker who had been at Belmont his entire life. He was strong, healthy, known for his ability to work long hours in the brutal heat without complaint. He had a wife, Clara, and 3 children. In late June, Crichton selected Henry for treatment. The reason wasn't clear. Henry hadn't been sick or slow. But Trent brought him to the correction house on a Tuesday morning. He emerged 2 days later. Clara said he was different immediately. He wouldn't speak to her. He wouldn't eat. He would stand in their cabin staring at the wall for hours. When she tried to touch him, he flinched away. In the fields, he worked with a strange intensity, moving faster than seemed humanly possible, never stopping, never resting. Other workers tried to talk to him, but he didn't respond. It was as if he couldn't hear them, or as if he'd forgotten how to process language. After 4 days, he collapsed in the field. The other workers carried him to the infirmary, where he lay on a cot, his eyes open but unseeing. He died that night without ever speaking again. The official cause of death was listed as fever, but everyone knew that wasn't right. Henry hadn't had a fever. He'd had something else, something that had been done to him in Crichton's building. 3 more people died over the next 2 weeks. All of them had recently undergone treatment. All of them exhibited similar symptoms: withdrawal, mechanical behavior, inability to eat or sleep, followed by sudden collapse. Crichton showed no concern. When Vance questioned the deaths, Crichton explained that some subjects were incompatible with the optimization process. It was unfortunate, he said, but inevitable. The benefits to the overall system outweighed the occasional loss. Vance, focused on the productivity numbers that were indeed improving, accepted this explanation. But in the quarters, the deaths created a crisis. People were terrified. They didn't understand what was happening in the correction house, but they knew it was dangerous. They knew that being selected for treatment might mean death, and they knew they had no way to refuse. In August, a woman named Ruth tried to run. She was 24 years old, a house servant who worked in the main house kitchen. She had been selected for treatment, and was scheduled to report to Creighton's building the following morning. Instead, she ran. She left in the middle of the night, taking nothing with her, heading north through the woods. She made it 6 miles before the dogs found her at dawn. The punishment was public and brutal. Vance, who rarely involved himself in discipline, made an exception. Ruth was whipped in front of the assembled population, a reminder of what happened to those who tried to escape. But the whipping wasn't the end of it. Afterward, she was taken to Creighton's building for what he called behavioral correction. She was inside for 3 days. When she emerged, she could walk and work, but she never spoke again. Not a word, not a sound. Her eyes were open, but they seemed empty, as if something essential had been removed. People who had known Ruth said it was like looking at a shell. The person who had been Ruth, who had loved singing, who had told funny stories, who had dreamed of freedom, was gone. What came back was something else. The incident with Ruth marked a turning point. Before there had been fear. Now there was terror. And beneath the terror, something else was growing, rage. But rage alone wasn't enough. The people at Belmont Estate had learned, through generations of bondage, that open rebellion was suicide. The system was designed to crush resistance. The laws, the weapons, the dogs, the neighboring plantations that would send reinforcements, all of it was arrayed against them. If they were going to act, they would need to be smart. They would need to be careful. They would need to plan. And they would need to do it in a way that Creighton, with all his observations and measurements and psychological theories, would never detect. If you're as disturbed by this as we are, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you think was really happening in Creighton's building. Because what comes next reveals that while Creighton thought he was controlling everything, he was actually missing the most important thing happening right under his nose. The truth is, while Creighton was conducting his experiments, convinced that he was breaking down individual will and preventing collective action, the people of Belmont Estate were doing something he never anticipated. They were organizing. The organization began in the most unlikely place, among the children. At Belmont Estate, as at most plantations, enslaved children occupied a strange position. They were too young to be seen as serious threats, too small to be worth the constant surveillance that adults endured. They moved through spaces that adults couldn't, carrying messages between the fields and the quarters, running errands to the main house, playing in areas that overseers ignored. And they were watching everything. In the months after Creighton's arrival, the children began exhibiting strange behaviors that adults noticed but overseers didn't. They would gather in specific locations at specific times, always briefly, never long enough to attract attention. Behind the woodshed at dusk, near the old well that no longer worked. In the space between 2 particular cabins where the shadows fell just right. They would sing certain songs, always the same ones, with lyrics that seemed innocuous but carried embedded meanings. Songs about rivers and stars and journeys. Songs their grandparents had taught them. Songs that had been passed down through generations, songs that contained maps and instructions disguised as simple melodies. One song, which a visitor to a neighboring plantation recorded in a journal, included the lines, "When the master sleeps and the river runs, we'll follow the drinking gourd to the promised sun." The drinking gourd was a known code for the Big Dipper, used by people escaping slavery to navigate north. But when the master sleeps and the river runs, those phrases were specific, temporal markers, instructions for timing. The children were messengers, carrying information in ways that seemed innocent. A child sent to bring water to the fields might pause to sing a particular song within earshot of certain workers. A child playing near the main house might repeat a phrase they'd overheard that was actually a coded message. And the adults were listening. The planning had begun in April, shortly after Creighton's assessment started. It began with a man named Samuel. Samuel was 41 years old, a skilled carpenter who had been at Belmont for 23 years. He had a unique position on the plantation. Because of his skills, he was given more freedom of movement than most. He repaired buildings, built furniture, maintained the structures that kept the plantation functioning. This meant he could move between the main house, the quarters, the outbuildings, and the fields without arousing suspicion. It also meant he had access to places other people didn't. In early April, while repairing a door at one of the storage buildings, Samuel noticed something. Creighton's building, the correction house, had a root cellar. He discovered it by accident. He'd been asked to check the building's foundation for water damage, and while examining the exterior, he noticed that the ground on one side sounded hollow when he tapped it. Further investigation revealed a wooden trapdoor, partially hidden by overgrown grass. The trapdoor was locked, but Samuel was skilled with locks. He returned that night, alone, and opened it. The root cellar was larger than he expected, about 10 feet square, with a dirt floor and stone walls. It was clearly old, probably built when the structure had been used for food storage years earlier. But what caught Samuel's attention was something else. One wall of the cellar had a gap at the bottom, a space where the stones didn't quite meet the ground. Cool air flowed through the gap. Samuel investigated further. The gap led to a tunnel. The tunnel was old, very old. It had been built decades earlier as part of the plantation's original drainage system, designed to divert water from the rice fields during heavy rains. The system had been replaced years ago with a more efficient design, and the old tunnels had been sealed and forgotten. But this one hadn't been completely sealed. It was still passable. Samuel explored as far as he dared that first night. The tunnel was about 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, shored up with timber that was rotting in places but still mostly intact. It ran underground, heading in the direction of the river. He couldn't follow it all the way. He didn't have enough light, and he needed to get back before his absence was noticed. But he'd seen enough. The tunnel was a way out. Over the next week, Samuel told 3 people, his wife, Rachel, and 2 men he trusted absolutely, Daniel and Joseph. Both were field workers, both were strong and smart, and both had families they were desperate to protect. They began to plan. The tunnel would need to be cleared. Parts of it had collapsed over the years, and debris blocked sections of the passage. They would need to shore up weak points. They would need to determine where it led and whether it was actually passable all the way to the river. And they would need to do all of this in secret, working in the one place on the plantation where they might not be observed. Underground, in Creighton's own building. It was audacious. It was dangerous. But it was possible. Samuel had learned to pick the lock on Creighton's building. The lock was good, but not perfect, and Samuel had been working with locks his entire adult life. He could open it in less than a minute. They began working at night. Small groups, never more than 3 or 4 people at a time, would slip into the building after dark, access the root cellar, and spend hours clearing the tunnel. They worked in complete darkness, unable to risk even a candle that might be seen through gaps in the walls. They moved debris by hand, feeling their way through the tunnel, shoring up weak points with stolen timber. It was exhausting, terrifying work. The tunnel was cramped and airless. The constant fear of collapse was overwhelming, and there was always the risk that Creighton would discover what they were doing. But they continued. By June, they had cleared nearly 100 yards of tunnel. They discovered that it ran for approximately 200 yards total, emerging in a wooded area near the river, well away from the main plantation buildings. The exit was partially concealed by undergrowth and had been sealed years ago with a wooden cover that had rotted away. With some work, it could be opened. They had found their escape route, but now they faced a bigger challenge: how to move 300 people through a narrow tunnel in a single night without being discovered. This is where the planning became truly complex. They needed to time the escape perfectly. It would have to be a night when security was relaxed, when overseers were distracted, when they would have the maximum amount of time before the disappearance was discovered. Christmas was the obvious choice. It was the one day each year when plantation owners traditionally gave enslaved workers a brief respite. Most overseers took the day off. The main house would be focused on its own celebrations. Security would be at its lowest. But there were still problems. The cabins were locked from the outside every night. The chains that bound certain individuals, those considered flight risks, were secured with locks that only Trent and Vance had keys for. They would need to solve these problems, and they would need to coordinate 300 people, men, women, children, elderly, sick, to move silently and quickly through a tunnel that could only accommodate a few people at a time. The planning consumed the summer and fall. More people were brought into the conspiracy, but carefully, selectively. Only people who could be trusted, absolutely. Only people who understood that a single mistake, a single betrayal, would mean death for everyone. They developed a system of signals. Certain songs meant certain things. Certain phrases spoken in certain contexts carried instructions. The children became the primary messengers, moving between groups, carrying information in ways that seemed innocent. They stockpiled supplies, small amounts of food, taken from rations and hidden in the tunnel, water containers, blankets, anything that might be needed for the journey after they emerged from the tunnel. They made contact with the Underground Railroad. This was perhaps the most dangerous part of the plan. The Underground Railroad network extended even into South Carolina, but it was secretive, fragmented, and constantly under threat. Making contact required finding someone who could be trusted, someone who could arrange for boats to be waiting at the river on Christmas night. Samuel made the contact through a free black man who worked as a ferryman on the Combahee River. The ferryman knew people who knew people. Messages were passed through a chain of intermediaries, each knowing only what they needed to know. By December, the plan was in place. On Christmas Eve, while the main house celebrated and the overseers drank and relaxed, the people of Belmont Estate would begin moving through the tunnel. They would go in groups, timed carefully to avoid crowding. The strongest would go first to help others through difficult sections. Families would stay together. The elderly and children would be assisted. They would emerge near the river, where boats would be waiting. Boats arranged by the Underground Railroad network. The boats would take them downriver to the coast, where they would be transferred to a ship. The ship would take them north, to Philadelphia, to freedom. It was an impossible plan. It required perfect timing, perfect coordination, and perfect luck. But it was the only plan they had. And then, 2 weeks before Christmas, something happened that threatened to destroy everything. Dr. Silas Creighton discovered what they were planning. The discovery happened on December 10th, 1859. Creighton had been working late in his building, reviewing his notes and preparing reports for Thomas Vance. The productivity numbers were excellent, exactly as he'd promised. The optimization system was working. Vance was pleased, but Creighton had noticed something odd in recent weeks. Small things, inconsistencies. Certain workers who should have been exhausted were showing unusual energy. People who should have been isolated were displaying signs of coordination. There were patterns in behavior that didn't match his predictions. Creighton was a man who believed in patterns. His entire system was built on the idea that human behavior was predictable, controllable, measurable. When patterns didn't match his expectations, he investigated. That night, while organizing his files, he heard a sound. It was faint, barely audible, a scraping sound coming from below. Creighton froze. He listened. The sound came again, definitely from below, from the root cellar. He took a lamp and descended the stairs to the cellar. The trapdoor was closed, but when he examined it closely, he saw fresh scratches around the lock. Someone had been opening it. Creighton opened the trapdoor and descended into the cellar. He found the tunnel immediately, and he found evidence that it had been recently used. Fresh footprints in the dirt, disturbed debris, the smell of human sweat in the stale air. Someone had been using his building to access an underground passage. Creighton's mind worked quickly. He understood immediately what this meant: an escape route. A secret passage that he hadn't known existed right beneath his own workspace. He should have alerted Vance immediately. He should have called for Trent and the overseers. He should have had the tunnel sealed and the conspirators identified and punished. But Creighton didn't do any of those things because he saw something else, an opportunity. This was the ultimate test of his system. A population under extreme duress, facing a binary choice between action and submission, would reveal the ultimate limits of behavioral conditioning. If his months of treatments had successfully suppressed their ability to organize and act collectively, the escape attempt would fail on its own. If it hadn't, he would learn exactly where his system had weaknesses. Either way, the data would be invaluable. He decided to let the escape attempt proceed, but he would control it. He would be there in the tunnel, observing. He would see how they behaved under pressure. He would document everything. It was, to him, the culmination of his experiment. He spent the next 2 weeks preparing. He recruited 2 men from Charleston, hired muscle, men who asked no questions and did what they were paid to do. He told them they would be helping him prevent an escape attempt, and he paid them well for their silence. He studied the tunnel, mapping its length and identifying the weakest points in its structure. He positioned supplies, ropes, tools, weapons at strategic locations, and he waited. He didn't tell Vance. He didn't tell Trent. This was his experiment, and he would control every variable. But Creighton made a critical error. He assumed that the people planning the escape were operating on instinct and desperation. He assumed they were disorganized, that their plan would be crude and easily disrupted. He was wrong. Because the people of Belmont Estate had been planning for 8 months. They had anticipated problems, they had backup plans, and they had something Creighton, with all his theories and measurements, had never understood. They had each other. On Christmas Eve, as the sun set over the Combahee River, the final preparations began. In the quarters, people moved through their evening routines as they always did. They cooked meals, they tended to children, they sang songs. To any observer, it was a normal evening. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Signals were being passed. Final instructions were being given. People were saying goodbye to the places they'd lived, the graves of family members they would never see again, the small pieces of life they'd managed to build in captivity. At the main house, Thomas Vance was hosting a Christmas Eve dinner for neighboring plantation owners. 8 guests, including their wives. The dining room was lit with candles. The table was laden with food. Wine flowed freely. Vance was in excellent spirits. The year had been profitable. Creighton's system had worked exactly as promised. The future looked bright. In the overseer's house, William Trent sat with his wife, drinking whiskey and looking forward to a rare day off. He'd locked the quarters himself, as he did every night. Everything was secure. In Creighton's building, the doctor waited in the darkness of the root cellar, his 2 hired men beside him. He had a lamp, but it was unlit. He didn't want to alert anyone to his presence. He had a pistol. He had his notebook. He was ready to observe. And in the quarters, as the last light faded from the sky, Samuel picked the lock on his cabin door. The escape had begun. The first group entered the tunnel at 8 o'clock. Samuel led them. 5 strong men who would clear any remaining obstacles and help others through difficult sections. They moved silently through the darkness, feeling their way along the tunnel walls, counting their steps to track their progress. Behind them, at carefully timed intervals, came more groups. Families stayed together. The elderly were assisted by younger workers. Children were carried. Everyone moved in complete silence. The tunnel was cramped and terrifying. The air was thick and stale. The darkness was absolute. But people kept moving, driven by the knowledge that freedom was at the other end. By 9 o'clock, nearly 100 people had entered the tunnel. That's when Creighton made his move. He lit his lamp. The sudden light in the tunnel was blinding. People froze, confused and terrified. Creighton stepped forward, his 2 hired men flanking him. He was positioned about halfway through the tunnel at a point where the passage narrowed. "Stop," he said. His voice echoed off the stone walls. For a moment no one moved. The people in front of Creighton were trapped between him and those behind them. The people behind couldn't see what was happening but could sense that something was wrong. Creighton raised his pistol. "You will return to the quarters," he said. "This escape attempt is over." But then something happened that Creighton hadn't anticipated. Someone started singing. It was a woman's voice, coming from somewhere in the darkness behind Creighton. One of the songs the children had been singing for months. The one about the river and the drinking gourd and the promised son. Other voices joined in, then more. Within seconds, dozens of people were singing, the sound filling the tunnel, echoing and amplifying until it was overwhelming. Creighton's hired men looked nervous. One of them raised his own weapon, but the singing continued, growing louder. And then, people started moving forward, not running, not attacking, just walking, steadily, toward Creighton and his men. Creighton fired his pistol into the air. The sound was deafening in the confined space. But the people kept coming, kept singing. One of the hired men panicked and ran, pushing past Creighton, heading back toward the root cellar. The other followed. Creighton found himself alone, facing a wall of people moving toward him with inexorable determination. He turned and ran. But in his panic, he made a fatal mistake. He dropped his lamp. The lamp shattered on the stone floor. The oil spread and ignited, flames racing across the ground and up the wooden supports that shored up the tunnel walls. The fire spread quickly. The old timber was dry and caught easily. Within seconds, a section of the tunnel was engulfed in flames. People screamed. The forward movement stopped as those in front tried to retreat from the fire. But there were too many people behind them, still pushing forward, unaware of what was happening ahead. The tunnel filled with smoke. The heat became unbearable. The wooden supports began to crack and splinter, and then a section of the tunnel collapsed. The collapse happened about 30 feet from where Creighton had been standing. Tons of earth and stone came down, blocking the passage completely. The people who were ahead of the collapse, those who had been in the first groups, including Samuel and the other leaders, were cut off from those behind. In the chaos and darkness, with smoke filling the air and the sound of screaming echoing off the walls, Samuel made a decision. "Keep moving," he shouted. "Forward. Get to the river." The group ahead of the collapse, 17 people in total, pushed forward through the smoke and heat. They could hear the sounds of the collapse continuing behind them, could feel the ground shaking. But they didn't stop. They reached the end of the tunnel and emerged into the cold night air. The boats were there, waiting just as planned. They climbed into the boats and pushed off from the shore, the current carrying them downstream into the darkness. Behind them, in the tunnel, 283 people were trapped. What happened to those 283 people in the hours after the collapse is one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. When investigators excavated the tunnel in the weeks following the discovery of the 17 survivors in Philadelphia, they found the collapsed section. They cleared it, expecting to find bodies. Hundreds of bodies, victims of the cave-in and the fire. But they found nothing. No bodies, no bones, no clothing, no personal effects. The tunnel beyond the collapse was empty. The investigators were baffled. They brought in engineers to examine the structure. They brought in miners who had experience with cave-ins. They searched every inch of the tunnel, from the root cellar to the river exit. Nothing. It was as if the people had simply vanished. Several theories were proposed. The first theory was that the bodies had been consumed by the fire. But this didn't make sense. The fire had been intense but brief. It had burned out quickly once the wooden supports were consumed, and fire doesn't completely destroy human remains. There should have been bones at minimum. The second theory was that the bodies had been washed away by water. The tunnel had been part of a drainage system after all. Perhaps water had flooded in after the collapse, carrying the bodies away. But when engineers examined the tunnel, they found no evidence of flooding. The ground was dry. There were no watermarks on the walls, and the tunnel didn't connect to any active waterways that could have produced such a flood. The third theory was that the survivors had somehow removed the bodies before fleeing. But this made no sense either. The 17 people who escaped had barely made it out themselves. They wouldn't have had time to move hundreds of bodies. And where would they have taken them? The mystery deepened when investigators examined Creighton's building more carefully. They found his notebooks, dozens of them, filled with observations, measurements, and theories. The notebooks revealed the extent of his experiments, the treatments he'd subjected people to, the psychological techniques he'd employed. But the final notebook, the one Creighton had been keeping in the weeks before Christmas, contained entries that were increasingly erratic. In early December, he wrote, "The subjects are exhibiting unexpected patterns of coordination. My conditioning protocols should have prevented collective action, yet I observe signs of organization. This requires further investigation." A week later, "I have discovered their escape route. Rather than prevent it, I will allow it to proceed under controlled observation. This presents an unprecedented opportunity to test the limits of my system." And then, on December 24th, the final entry. The handwriting was barely legible, the words running together. "They are not what I believed. The conditioning did not. They have done something I cannot. The tunnel is. They are singing and the sound I cannot." The entry ended mid-sentence. Creighton's body was never found. Neither were the bodies of his 2 hired men. The mystery consumed the local authorities for months. The disappearance of 300 enslaved people was a massive financial loss for Thomas Vance, a loss he could not afford. He offered enormous rewards for information. He hired private investigators. He traveled to neighboring states, searching for any sign of the missing people. He found nothing. The story spread through the South, creating panic among plantation owners. If 300 people could disappear from a locked plantation without a trace, what did that mean for the security of the entire system? Newspapers published wild theories. Some claimed it was an elaborate conspiracy involving northern abolitionists. Others suggested that the people had been smuggled onto ships and taken to the Caribbean or South America. A few even proposed supernatural explanations, though these were quickly dismissed by serious investigators. But no theory could explain the physical evidence, or the lack of it. And then, 3 weeks after the disappearance, the 17 survivors were discovered in Philadelphia. The discovery of the survivors should have solved the mystery. Instead, it deepened it. The 17 people were found hidden in the hold of the Meridian Star, a merchant vessel that had departed from Charleston 2 weeks earlier. They were emaciated, dehydrated, and terrified, but they were alive. Federal marshals, operating under the Fugitive Slave Act, took them into custody. Thomas Vance traveled to Philadelphia to identify and reclaim his property. But the 17 refused to speak in front of Vance or the federal authorities. They would only talk to Margaret Lindsay, a Quaker abolitionist who had been providing aid to freedom seekers for years. Lindsay met with them in the jail where they were being held. She spent hours listening to their stories, taking notes, trying to understand what had happened. What they told her was documented in letters she wrote to fellow abolitionists, letters that were later published in anti-slavery newspapers, though their authenticity was fiercely disputed by Southern publications. According to these accounts, the escape had been planned for 8 months, exactly as investigators had suspected. The tunnel had been cleared in secret. The timing had been carefully calculated. The boats had been arranged through Underground Railroad contacts. Everything had been going according to plan until Creighton appeared in the tunnel. The survivors described the confrontation: Creighton's lamp, his pistol, his demand that they return. They described the singing that had started spontaneously, the way people had moved forward despite the threat. They described the fire and the collapse. But then their accounts became fragmented and contradictory. One woman, whose name was recorded only as E, told Lindsay something that didn't appear in the official reports. She said that when the tunnel collapsed, she was near the front of the group, close enough to make it through before the passage was completely blocked. But she could hear what was happening behind her. She heard screaming at first, as expected. But then the screaming stopped and she heard something else. Singing. It was coming from deeper in the tunnel, from the direction where the others had been trapped. Not screaming, not crying, singing. The same songs the children had been singing for months. The ones with the coded messages. It was like they knew, E told Lindsay. Like they'd planned for this too. Like the collapse wasn't the end. It was part of something else. Lindsay pressed her for details. What did she mean? What could they have planned? E couldn't explain. She only knew what she'd heard. Singing, growing louder, echoing through the tunnel even as the collapse continued. Another survivor, a man named Peter, told a different story. He claimed that he'd been near the back of the group that made it through. He'd looked back just before the final collapse, and in the light of the flames, he'd seen something that made no sense. He saw people. He couldn't tell who in the darkness, deliberately pulling down the support beams. Not accidentally, not in panic. Deliberately, methodically bringing down the tunnel behind them. They were sealing it, Peter said. On purpose. They didn't want anyone to follow. Lindsay asked the obvious question, why would they seal themselves in? Peter had no answer. He only knew what he'd seen. A third survivor, a young woman named Sarah, told yet another story. She said that in the days before Christmas there had been whispers in the quarters, whispers about a second plan. She didn't know the details. She was young, and the adults had been careful about what they said around children. But she'd heard fragments. Something about the deep way. Something about where the masters can't follow. She didn't understand what it meant, but she remembered the phrase because it had been repeated so often in the final days. If the first way fails, we take the deep way. Lindsay documented all of these accounts. She sent letters to abolitionist newspapers in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. She testified before anti-slavery societies. She tried to use the story to fuel opposition to slavery. But the accounts were so contradictory, so strange, that many people dismissed them as exaggerations or fabrications. Southern newspapers certainly did, claiming that Lindsay had invented the entire story to serve her abolitionist agenda. The 17 survivors were eventually returned to slavery under the Fugitive Slave Act. They were transported back to South Carolina in chains, but they never returned to Belmont Estate. Thomas Vance, perhaps fearing that their presence would inspire others, sold them to different plantations across the state. They were separated, scattered, their stories lost. Margaret Lindsay continued to search for answers. She corresponded with other abolitionists, trying to find any trace of the missing 283 people. She never found anything. In the months and years following the disappearance, there were scattered reports, fragments of information that suggested the missing people might have survived, might have found freedom, but each report raised more questions than it answered. In February of 1860, a rice merchant named Thomas Garrett was traveling through the coastal swamps about 15 miles south of Belmont Estate. He was following an old hunting trail when he came across something unexpected. A camp. It was recent. The fire pit still contained warm ashes. There were signs that many people had been there. Makeshift shelters constructed from branches and moss, areas where the ground had been cleared for sleeping, discarded tools. But the camp was empty. Whoever had been there was gone. Garrett reported the discovery to local authorities. A search party was organized, but by the time they reached the location, any trail had vanished. The swamp was vast and treacherous. Tracking anyone through it was nearly impossible. The authorities concluded that the camp had probably been used by a group of runaways from various plantations. They didn't connect it to Belmont Estate. But the timing was suggestive, and the scale of the camp, large enough for dozens, perhaps hundreds of people, was unusual. In April of 1860, a ferryman named Jacob Mills, who operated a crossing on the Savannah River between South Carolina and Georgia, reported something odd to his local sheriff. He said he'd transported a large group of black travelers, he estimated about 40 people, across the river one night. They'd paid him in gold coins, which was unusual. Enslaved people didn't have gold. Even free black people rarely had that kind of money. Mills said the group had been quiet, organized, and purposeful. They'd crossed at night, heading into Georgia, and disappeared into the woods on the other side. When the sheriff investigated, he found no trace of the group, and Mills couldn't provide detailed descriptions. It had been dark, and he'd been more interested in the gold than in the faces of his passengers. The story was dismissed as probably unrelated to Belmont Estate. After all, Georgia was a long way from the Combahee River. How could people have traveled that far without being detected? But the gold was interesting. Where would escaped slaves have gotten gold? In June of 1860, a shopkeeper in Wilmington, North Carolina, reported selling supplies to a woman who spoke with an accent he couldn't place. She'd bought food, blankets, and medical supplies, a lot of them, more than one person would need. She'd paid in cash, and she'd been polite, but distant. When the shopkeeper tried to make conversation, asking where she was from, she'd given vague answers and left quickly. The shopkeeper remembered her because of the way she spoke. He said it was like she'd forgotten how to form certain words, like she was relearning language. This report, too, was dismissed. North Carolina was even farther from Belmont Estate. The connection seemed impossible, but the description of the woman's speech was haunting. It matched descriptions of some of the people who had undergone Creighton's treatments, people who had emerged from the correction house changed, struggling with language and memory. Could she have been one of the missing people from Belmont? And if so, how had she gotten to North Carolina? There were other reports scattered across the South over the next 2 years. A group of black travelers seen on a road in Virginia. A community of free black people in Tennessee that seemed to have appeared suddenly. Rumors of a settlement deep in the Appalachian Mountains where people lived in secret, away from white society. None of these reports were confirmed. None could be definitively connected to Belmont Estate. But taken together, they suggested a possibility that at least some of the missing people had survived, had escaped, and had found ways to live in freedom. But what about the others? What about the 283 people who had been trapped in the tunnel? If they had died in the collapse, where were their bodies? If they had escaped through some other route, where had they gone? And what did the survivors mean when they talked about the deep way and where the masters can't follow? In March of 1861, just weeks before the Civil War began, something happened that reignited interest in the Belmont Estate mystery. A package arrived at the offices of the Charleston Mercury newspaper. It was a small wooden box, carefully wrapped, with no return address. Inside was a single item, a chain. It was one of the chains that had been found at Belmont Estate on Christmas morning, the chains that had bound certain individuals and had been found unlocked and carefully arranged. The chain was accompanied by a note, written in careful, elegant script on good paper. "We are not lost. We are free. And we remember." The note was unsigned. The newspaper published a brief article about the package, including a description of the chain and a transcription of the note. The article speculated about who might have sent it and what it meant, but by then, the nation was consumed by the approaching war. South Carolina had seceded from the Union. Fort Sumter would be attacked within weeks. The mystery of Belmont Estate, which had dominated local news for over a year, faded from public attention. Thomas Vance lost his plantation during the war. The Union Army occupied the Low Country in 1862, and Belmont Estate was abandoned. The enslaved people who had remained, those who hadn't disappeared on Christmas, were freed. Vance never recovered financially. He died in 1867, still offering a reward for information about the disappearance, still searching for answers. Dr. Silas Creighton was never seen again after Christmas Eve 1859. His family in Pennsylvania, when contacted by investigators, claimed no knowledge of his work in South Carolina. They said he'd always been secretive about his research. When investigators looked into his credentials, they discovered that much of his background was fabricated. The university he claimed to have attended had no record of him. The papers he claimed to have published didn't exist. Creighton, it seemed, had been as much a mystery as the disappearance itself. The tunnel was eventually filled in. The buildings at Belmont Estate were torn down in the 1880s. The land was sold and subdivided. Rice cultivation in the area declined as the economy changed. Today, there's a small historical marker near where Belmont Estate once stood. It mentions the plantation's role in rice cultivation and notes that it was abandoned during the Civil War. It doesn't mention the disappearance. It doesn't mention the 300 people who vanished on Christmas morning. It doesn't mention Dr. Creighton or his experiments. The story has been largely forgotten, but the mystery remains. Over the years, historians and researchers have proposed various theories about what happened to the missing people of Belmont Estate. Theory 1. Mass death in the tunnel. The most straightforward explanation is that the 283 people trapped in the tunnel died in the collapse and fire, and their bodies were somehow lost or destroyed. But this theory has significant problems. As mentioned earlier, fire doesn't completely destroy human remains. And the tunnel was examined thoroughly. There should have been some evidence of mass death. Some researchers have suggested that perhaps the bodies were removed later, either by the survivors who escaped or by others who wanted to hide the evidence. But this seems logistically impossible. Moving hundreds of bodies through a collapsed tunnel would have required enormous effort and time. Theory 2. Alternative escape route. Another theory is that the trapped people found an alternative escape route, perhaps another branch of the old drainage system that investigators didn't discover. This is more plausible. The drainage system at Belmont Estate had been extensive, and not all of it had been mapped. It's possible that there were other tunnels, other exits, that the trapped people discovered in their desperation. If they escaped through an alternative route, they might have emerged far from the plantation, in a location where they could scatter and disappear into the landscape. But this theory doesn't explain the singing that survivors reported hearing, or the deliberate collapse that Peter claimed to have witnessed. Why would people seal the tunnel behind them if they were trying to escape? Theory 3. The Underground Railroad. Some historians have suggested that the Underground Railroad network was more extensive and better organized than previously believed, and that it managed to evacuate the trapped people through some secret means. This theory is appealing because it gives the story a hopeful ending. But it's difficult to support with evidence. The Underground Railroad was indeed active in South Carolina, but it operated in small groups, moving people carefully and slowly. The idea that it could have evacuated nearly 300 people from a collapsed tunnel seems far-fetched. Theory 4. Maroon communities. This theory suggests that the missing people didn't try to reach the north at all. Instead, they established a maroon community, a hidden settlement in the swamps or mountains where they could live in freedom, away from white society. Maroon communities existed throughout the Americas, including in the United States. The Great Dismal Swamp on the Virginia-North Carolina border harbored such communities for decades. The swamps of South Carolina and Georgia could have provided similar refuge. The reports of camps and settlements that surfaced in the months after the disappearance support this theory. Perhaps the missing people of Belmont Estate joined or established such a community, living in secret for years or even decades. But if this is true, why has no definitive evidence ever been found? Why did no one from the community ever come forward, even after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished? Theory 5. Deliberate concealment. The most disturbing theory is that the missing people did die in the tunnel, but that their deaths were deliberately concealed by authorities who didn't want the story to become public. The disappearance of 300 enslaved people was a massive embarrassment for South Carolina's plantation system. It suggested that the system wasn't as secure as owners believed. It could have inspired other escape attempts. Perhaps authorities removed the bodies and buried them in secret, then claimed they'd found nothing in order to minimize the story's impact. This theory is dark, but it's not impossible. Cover-ups of inconvenient truths were common in the antebellum South, but it doesn't explain the reports of survivors seen in other states, or the package sent to the Charleston Mercury, or the testimonies of the 17 people who escaped. The truth is, we may never know what happened to the 283 people who vanished from Belmont Estate. But there's one more piece of evidence worth considering. Evidence that emerged decades later and suggests a possibility that no one at the time considered. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the Federal Writers Project sent interviewers across the South to record the testimonies of formerly enslaved people. It was a massive undertaking, designed to preserve the memories of a generation that was rapidly disappearing. One of these interviews was conducted in rural Georgia in 1937. The interviewer, a young woman named Helen Crawford, spoke with an elderly black woman who gave her name only as Aunt Bess. Aunt Bess was believed to be in her 80s, though she didn't know her exact age. She had been born into slavery and had lived through the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the difficult decades that followed. Crawford asked her about her memories of slavery. Aunt Bess spoke about the plantation where she'd grown up, about the work she'd done, about the family members she'd lost. And then Crawford asked if she remembered anything unusual from that time, any stories that had stuck with her over the years. Aunt Bess was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I remember before the war. I remember people talking about the plantation where everybody walked away. It was down in South Carolina near the river. My grandmother told me about it. She said it was a Christmas miracle." Crawford asked her to explain. "My grandmother said they didn't run," Aunt Bess continued. "They walked, together, and they went somewhere the masters couldn't follow, because the masters didn't believe it existed." Crawford asked what she meant. "Where did they go?" Aunt Bess smiled. "Freedom," she said. "They went to freedom. And once you really believe in it, really believe it's possible, you can find ways to get there that nobody else can see." Crawford pressed her for more details. Did her grandmother know anyone from that plantation? Did she know what actually happened? Aunt Bess shook her head. "My grandmother just said that sometimes, when people have nothing left to lose, they find strength they didn't know they had. And sometimes when people work together, really together, they can do things that seem impossible." She paused, then added, "My grandmother said the masters never understood that. They thought if you broke people down one by one, you could control them. But they didn't understand that breaking people down could also bring them together, that shared suffering could become shared strength." The interview is preserved in the Library of Congress, part of the Federal Writers Project collection. It's a brief document, just a few pages, and it doesn't provide any concrete information about what happened at Belmont Estate. But it offers something else, a perspective that the white investigators and newspaper reporters of 1859 never considered. Perhaps the missing people of Belmont Estate didn't escape in spite of what Creighton had done to them. Perhaps they escaped because of it. Creighton's experiments had been designed to break individual will, to create isolated, controllable subjects. But perhaps instead, they'd created a shared experience of trauma that bound people together more strongly than anything else could have. Perhaps the treatments, the fear, the deaths, perhaps all of it had forged a collective determination that was stronger than any individual will could have been. Perhaps that's what the singing in the tunnel represented. Not panic, not despair, but unity. A declaration that they were together, that they would face whatever came as one. And perhaps the deep way that survivors mentioned wasn't a physical route at all. Perhaps it was something else, a psychological or spiritual journey that people undertook together, a transformation that allowed them to survive in ways that their oppressors couldn't understand or track. This is speculation, of course, there's no way to prove it. But it offers an explanation for why the bodies were never found, why the survivors' accounts were so contradictory, why the reports of sightings were so scattered and vague. Perhaps the people of Belmont Estate didn't just escape. Perhaps they transformed. Perhaps they found a way to exist that was so different from what their masters expected that they became, in effect, invisible. What do you think happened to the missing people of Belmont Estate? Do you believe they found freedom, or did something else occur that night in the tunnel? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story has made you think about the mysteries that history leaves behind, share this video with someone who loves unsolved mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content and subscribe to never miss stories like this. There are more mysteries waiting to be explored. The mystery of Belmont Estate has never been officially solved. The 17 survivors who were captured in Philadelphia and returned to slavery were eventually freed during the Civil War. Most of them disappeared into the chaos of Reconstruction, and their later lives are unknown. Margaret Lindsay continued her abolitionist work until her death in 1879. She never stopped searching for information about the missing people, but she never found definitive answers. The tunnel at Belmont Estate was filled in during the 1870s when the property was sold. The new owners wanted no reminders of the plantation's past. Dr. Silas Creighton's notebooks were eventually donated to a historical society in Charleston. They remained in storage, largely unexamined, until the 1920s, when a researcher studying the history of slavery in South Carolina discovered them. The notebooks revealed the full extent of Creighton's experiments, the psychological techniques he'd used, the treatments he'd administered, the theories he'd been testing. They were disturbing documents, evidence of systematic dehumanization disguised as scientific research. But they also revealed something else. Creighton had been wrong. His entire system was based on the assumption that human beings could be reduced to predictable, controllable components. That will could be broken, behavior could be shaped, and resistance could be eliminated through the right combination of conditioning and control. The disappearance of 300 people proved him wrong. Despite months of treatments, despite the fear and trauma he'd inflicted, despite his careful observations and measurements, the people of Belmont Estate had organized, planned, and acted collectively. They had maintained hope. They had protected each other. They had found a way to resist. Creighton's final notebook entry, the one that ended mid-sentence, suggests that he realized this in his last moments. "They are not what I believed," he wrote. "The conditioning did not." He had discovered too late that human beings are not machines. That will cannot be completely broken. That people, even in the most desperate circumstances, can find ways to maintain their humanity and fight for their freedom. The chain that was sent to the Charleston Mercury in 1861 was never traced to a specific sender, but its message was clear. We are not lost. We are free, and we remember. Whether the missing people of Belmont Estate all survived, whether they found freedom, whether they established communities where they could live in peace, these questions remain unanswered. But perhaps the most important truth is this: they tried. In the face of overwhelming oppression, in a system designed to crush hope, 300 people came together and attempted the impossible. They planned for months. They worked in secret. They risked everything. And on Christmas morning, 1859, they walked away from Belmont Estate, leaving only their chains behind. That act of collective resistance, regardless of its ultimate outcome, stands as a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be broken. The historical marker near the site of Belmont Estate doesn't mention any of this. It doesn't tell the story of the disappearance, or of Dr. Creighton's experiments, or of the 300 people who vanished. But the story exists in archives, in old newspapers, in the testimonies of survivors, in the memories passed down through generations. And it exists in the questions that remain unanswered. What happened in that tunnel on Christmas Eve, 1859? Where did the missing people go? How did they survive, if they survived? And what did they mean when they said they went somewhere the masters couldn't follow? These questions may never be fully answered, but they remind us that history is full of mysteries, events that challenge our understanding, that resist simple explanations, that force us to confront the limits of what we know. The story of Belmont Estate is one of those mysteries. 300 people don't just disappear, but maybe, just maybe, they found a way to vanish that was more powerful than anyone imagined possible. Maybe they found freedom not just as a destination, but as a state of being. Something that couldn't be tracked by bloodhounds, couldn't be recaptured by slave catchers, couldn't be destroyed by the system that had tried to break them. Maybe that's what the deep way meant. Not a physical route, but a transformation so profound that it made them invisible to those who had only ever seen them as property. Maybe that's the real mystery of Belmont Estate. Not where the people went, but how they became free in a way that their oppressors could never understand or undo. This story shows us that even in the darkest moments of history, people found ways to resist, to hope, and to fight for freedom. What do you think really happened that Christmas night? Do you believe the missing people found freedom, or is there another explanation? Leave your comment below and let's discuss this mystery together. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most puzzling disappearances, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the stories that history tried to forget. Share this video with someone who loves mysteries, and check out our other videos on screen for more stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the past. See you in the next video. The chains from Belmont Estate were never found again after that package arrived at the Charleston Mercury. But somewhere in South Carolina, in the swamps and forests that have reclaimed what used to be plantation land, there might still be traces of what happened that Christmas night. 300 people don't just disappear, but maybe, just maybe, they found a way to vanish that was more powerful than anyone imagined possible. And maybe their story, the story of how they came together, how they planned, how they walked away from bondage, is more important than knowing exactly where they went. Because the act of walking away, the act of choosing freedom even in the face of impossible odds, is itself a kind of victory. And that victory, that choice, that moment when 300 people said no more and walked into the unknown together, that's the real story of Belmont Estate. That's the story that history tried to forget. But we remember.